Reincarnation by Hashnu Hara. Published 1911. Of all the doctrines with reference to the teachings of Theosophy which have held me fascinated and enthralled, the belief in reincarnation is possibly first and most powerful. There is something in the very idea even which helps to make things easier for us all round. It is a question upon which we never tire of speculating, and there are few people who do not believe in it, more or less. Those of my readers who are not familiar with the teaching are still aware that reincarnation means rebirth, the coming back to earth life again and again. If we can regard this earth life as a waking period, and our existence after death as sleep, with a time immediately following death as that of drowsy slumber, during which the earth life still figures quite clearly previous to that deeper slumber, into which we subsequently fall when we live in our dreams upon another plane of consciousness. If we can imagine again, that, having had sufficient slumber we are again rousing ourselves towards earth life before rebirth into the physical form through earthly parents, then, I think, we can have a fairly tangible, if somewhat crude, idea of the process we undergo between one incarnation and another. The length of time spent away from Earth in the realm of bliss depends upon the Earth life of the incarnating ego. It is usually about 1500 years. The advanced and spiritualized ego will spend a very much longer period in the dwelling of the gods, or devachan, than will the undeveloped and immature ego. If we look upon reincarnation as synonymous with evolution, we shall not go far wrong. It is the evolution of the divine mode, the spiritual divine souls linked, which makes reincarnation a necessity. This evolution of the soul begins with the lowest forms of inanimate life. At one time you and I were as the stone we kick aside idly when we walk. Inanimate, with no conscious life, yet all the time saturated with the divine mode. Please understand by this word, the spiritual divine souls in combination, since the double-barreled word is rather tiresome to use. Then, possibly after long ages, the stone came to life, vegetable life, in the lowest form maybe, but still, a growing living thing. Then by degrees it passed through the vegetable kingdom, slowly evolving until one day it became a denizen of the animal kingdom. Again very low down, some crawling creeping thing such as we daily pass with unseeing eyes. Still slowly it evolved into the higher forms of animal life, until it began to achieve a certain amount of conscious intelligence, as opposed to the pure instinct which rules the lower forms of the animal kingdom. At last came the day when it was ready to become human, when the conscious intelligence was slightly increased, and very low down in the human scale it entered the form in which it is, so far as we know at present, destined to qualify for the perfectly evolved being. I do not think it is quite clear how far the mind-soul governs the purely animal race. I may clash very much with Theosophists when I say that I cannot believe it to be entirely absent. It is necessary to realize that the mode, or divine spiritual soul, is the imperishable vital spark, which, traveling from the infinite, is sent out to evolve by the processes I have so briefly named, until it is educated and ready to return to the center from which it came. In the crudest forms it just exists, such as in the stone. In fact, it interpenetrates every atom of matter here on earth, if your imagination can conjure up such a pictory, just as the sun, when shining, pours its radiant light on all things, good, bad and indifferent alike. Matter is composed of atoms and molecules. A molecule is the smallest portion of matter that can exist without changing its nature. An atom is an indivisible portion of matter. Atoms unite to form molecules, and a collection of molecules form a mass or body. Electrons, or ions, are the smallest bodies known. There was a time when the atom felt small. It is not big. It is true, but it is getting to feel quite a large thing beside the electron. They illustrate the difference between the atom and the electron. Imagine the electron to be the size of a full stop, as heated, and an atom, a church, 160 feet long, 80 feet broad and 40 feet high. In an atom of hydrogen there are 1,000 electrons. Imagine these 1,000 full stops thrown into that church and some idea will be obtained of the relative size of the atom, its properties, and enable it to act chemically. The electrons are revolving around each other at a tremendous speed. They are not in the least crowded. It has been suggested that solar systems may be atoms of a still larger universe. Thus the Earth, the Moon, and the rest of our planetary bodies would be electrons. Atoms, of course, continue so small as to be far below the power of the best microscope, and when the physicists scoop out the inside of this infinitesimal speck, and put into it 100,000 smaller specks, and still have room for the 100,000 to chase each other round at the rate of several miles a second, and only rarely bumping, it is not perhaps to be wondered at that the layman finds it somewhat difficult to follow him. Science has at last discovered the mysterious forces which move the universe, which hold the stars in leash, which give the sun its light and the earth its life, and which, according to the most profound thinkers, will revolutionize all economic conditions of human existence. These newly revealed forces, which are yet as old as the eternal ages, are called ions. Hitherto, the smallest known particle of matter has been the atom and the molecule, a particle so minute that the most powerful microscopes in the world are unable to bring it to light. Yet within that atom, there is a universe of revolving ions, whirling in their separate orbits, obeying their own laws, clashing in ruin, or flying off on a tangent into space. They are tiny earths, and moons, and stars, and all the phenomena of our giant solar system repeated on a scale so inconceivably small, that the mind reels in the attempts to conceive the fact, and science has discovered that these ions are youth. We eat universes and solar systems for our daily food. They give us power, and sight, and intelligence, and all our thoughts and emotions. They continue to whirl and buzz in our veins and throughout our physical being. As the tiny stems clash and explode and rush together, or they revivify the blood by atomic radiation. There can be no life or death, or matter itself, where there are no ions. Therefore ions, in varying numbers, form everything in nature. A combination of 700 ions to the atom produces hydrogen. An atom with 11,200 ions is an atom of oxygen. An atom containing 137,000,010 is an atom of gold. A planetary system, represented by 36,853 ions, is an atom of the human. This is from an article by Professor Oliver Lodge, in the New York World some few years ago. I quote it because it will help you to understand how spirit can interpenetrate matter. When, as I believe, all these ions are themselves penetrated by the spirit which gives them life. If we consider, then, that an atom of gold has 37,200 living, moving particles or ions, it becomes very much easier to comprehend the gradual evolution of that atom, because we know it is not inert, as might very reasonably be supposed at a casual glance. Time, as we reckon it, is not recognized in the infinite. During the eons of time gone past, the evolution of the human race has been accomplished, but what length of years those eons represent we cannot even blindly guess. For instance, the periods known as Brahma's day and Brahma's night are supposed to represent a little space of 2,160,000,000 years each. During the day, Brahma is said to have come forth and built up the material and natural world, and during the night he sleeps. Brahma represents, not a god or deity, as might be supposed, but the vivifying and creative force which is found throughout nature. This force, which is positive and masculine, becomes periodically active, and in the same way passes into a subjective or sleeping state, much as the sap sleeps in the trees during winter. There are said to be alternate days and nights of Brahma, which last for 2,160,000 years each. When we try to realize what these figures mean, which is not easy from our tiny outlook of 1900 years, it is easy to understand, however, the possibility of passing gradually from the mineral to the human kingdom. Easy to believe that within our ego, all the experience we have acquired through those long and varying stages is stored up, at our service, if we have but the faith to call forth that knowledge from our subconscious mind. The knowledge we have not, and cannot obtain until ready to receive it, is that pertaining to the bliss eternal which is ours when we have learned the lessons set for us here on earth, and gone through all the experiences which go to fit us for that glorious future. It is easier to understand if we realize that, literally, is no dead matter. Science has triumphantly corroborated the truths known to occultists for countless ages, at last. Then, so far as the mode is concerned, it is necessary to enlarge somewhat on this point, for an erroneous idea may very easily be acquired. The mode in its lowest form of existence is not individual, but general. That means, of course, that the spiritual divine essence penetrating the mineral and vegetable kingdom is not as yet divided into individual egos or essences, but interpenetrates all such matter collectively. It means that you, personally, or I, personally, did not begin life with our ego encased in solitary grandeur in a nugget of gold, or an agate pebble, and from that became similarly encased in a moss, or some other form of vegetable life, until at length we took to ourselves the 7 principles of man. On the contrary, we were simply a manifestation of an aggregate of similar spiritual divine atoms, all a part of the whole, as water makes a whole, though divisible into atoms and ions, and without any individual consciousness whatever. That comes later as the mode ascends the scale of evolution, when it gradually withdraws from the condition of being just a cosmic force and begins to acquire an individuality of its own. I think I am right in saying that it is the first dawning consciousness which marks the taking on of the mind-body, however crude in its manifestation, that marks the hour of differentiation, when the cosmic mode becomes an individual mode. Even though that individuality is roughly expressed, as a baby's drawing of a man, 2 circles for head and body, with lines sticking out at right angles for hands and feet, may be in comparison to the finished painting of an aura. If we remember all this, it makes the conception of the impetratio of matter in the spirit a great deal easier to understand. It is only when the mode reaches the animal stage that this crude individualizing first dawns. Very faintly, hardly perceptible, and not in every species, but I cannot believe it possible that some of the beasties who have been my friends through life, have not that dawning. Their mental outfit is something more than instinct. I have our horses, dogs and cats that were more intelligent, more human, and more loving and far more honorable, than many of the humans who are supposed to be quite advanced. However, that point is open to controversy, I know, so I will leave it, and the student may believe as I do, that the first glimmer of individuality the mode knows is in the more advanced forms of animal life, or, as an orthodox theosophist would hold, it begins in human form only, and then in its lowest aspect. But even when thus individualized, the divine spiritual soul of us, the mode, is still cosmic, still one. The same divine flood that illuminates your soul, illuminates mine. We only express it in a different way, through the acquired individuality we call the brotherhood of the world. Would be better realized if we could only clearly grasp the relationship between the cosmic mode and the individualized mode. If we could only realize that it is one force differently expressed, I think very much of the troubles of this world would vanish, and forever. Anyhow, apart from that, the individualized mode, as soon as it takes on the mental or mind-soul, and begins to exist apart from the cosmic entity, also begins to dress itself in the various bodies, which, as I have already explained, it sheds at the time of death. The evolution, or state of evolution, in which the ego has arrived at the moment of death, of course determines the length of time spent by the higher principles in the dwelling of the gods, or devachan. It is not, of course, possible for the cosmic mode to retire for the rest in the dwelling of the gods. Up to the time the individuality is acquired, they simply evolve. It is the individuality reaches the fad of bliss and rest, remaining for a period of 1500 years or so in an ordinary way, although the advanced and spiritualized soul will spend a very much longer period of rest than will the immature and undeveloped ego. In the case of criminals and very wicked people, the reincarnation takes place very rapidly, and it is held doubtful if they have the chance of entering the state of bliss at all. This, I think, applies specially to such egos as continue in wickedness from one incarnation to another, refusing to acquire the lesson they are sent there to learn. If you will endeavor to remember that the individuality of the ego remains the same during each incarnation, simply unfolding as a rose may unfold as it grasps and assimilates the experiences which befall it, and strives to climb upward towards spirit. If you will understand that the period in the state of bliss is both a rest from the toils and struggles here on earth, and a reward for effort made towards right unfoldment, it becomes easy to understand how the crude and evil spirits re-enter rapidly upon this earth life, and how the higher and more spiritual ego spends a greater period in the dwelling of the gods. The physical form, the sex, the social standing, vary from one incarnation to the other. The individuality which reincarnates is sexless, formless. It gains sex and form as it becomes clothed with the lower principles, which give it material form and figure. It takes up the new life where it left off the old, only having gained so much experience as was passed through and assimilated in the previous life, and in the new life drawing to itself just so much of the gross or ethereal as belonged to it. Without attempting to enter into any explanation of the 7 planes of existence, a subject far beyond this ABC of theosophy, it may be a help if we consider the various forms of existence here as planes. A plane in this sense may be explained as a level, a degree of consciousness, esoterically, which marks the stage of progress or development towards spiritual perfection. For instance, the poet, Browning, and the murderer, Cripp, would be on different planes. When we are awake here on earth, we are in one state of consciousness or on one plane, and when we sleep and dream we are on another. When we come to analyze these conditions, it will be found that the majority of people on this planet at the present time are on the first 4 planes of consciousness, which represent the animal, material, and purely intellectual, for comparatively few have reached the higher spiritual planes. The starting point, of course, as I have already explained, is the divine essence, the mode which, groping through the dark stages of the first plane of existence, gradually evolves into the lowest manifestation of human consciousness, when the ego only functions on the purely physical side, with no spark of spiritual consciousness, unless a certain form of blind superstition be taken to represent this, and very little intellectual, a body made up with the first 4 principles only in manifestation, the remaining 3 clouded and undeveloped. An ego may be born again and again into this plane of being, before growing sufficiently conscious of development and desire to push forward and out of it to the next plane, where it would again be under slightly more advanced conditions, but still more physical than mental. According to Mrs. Annie Besant and to Madame Blavatsky, new entries from the animal into the human kingdom are cycle in origin and are permitted periodically. Thus the inflow of the mode from the animal to the human kingdom was continuous through the 3rd race, and, during part of the 4th, when it ceased for that cycle, and we do not know when the door will again be opened. At the present time the people incarnating here on earth belong to the 5th race. Gradually the intellect would develop, the individuality or the mind-body become more pronounced, and the ego grow intellectually, and, having passed through the fourth plane of existence, will begin to reach out towards the spiritual on the fifth, growing in this sphere, until, having passed through the sixth and seventh plane, it becomes no longer necessary for him to reincarnate, and he is free at last from earth life and experiences, and becomes reabsorbed into the divine effulgence. The point of greatest interest to many students is the status of the soul, or ego, during the period between one incarnation and the next. At the time of death, the disaccaritic ego, if I may use such a term, is clothed in an astral robe of colors which clearly indicate the state of advancement he has reached, and which clearly represents his earthly life and characteristics. Such astral form is on exactly the same plane as during earth life, knows no more and no less. As I have already explained, this astral dress or body gradually fades away, as the body physically fades and decomposes, and the ego loses its memories of earth life and associations also by degrees. H.P. Blavatsky calls it a fool's paradise somewhere in her works, but it is still a paradise. Our hell is here on earth, perhaps our heaven also, but be that as it may, Theosophy teaches of a period of rest and oblivion to evil and its consequences. A period like unto a dream, between one earth life and another. As the astral body loses form and becomes gradually extinct, it loses the memory of earth life, as already stated above, and the individuality acquired by that incarnation becomes a part of the ego. Gradually, as memory fails, the ego awakens to the state of bliss, and becomes conscious of the perfection of its expression. The ego remains in this condition until all trace of the material has vanished and it possesses only the essence of its earth memories, much as the precious metal becomes separated from the rough ore in the crucible. It is now ready to enter the state known as divine love and wisdom. Here it remains for a varying length of time, dependent, as I have already pointed out, upon the stage of evolution it has reached. Gradually, however, it again, by desire, projects itself towards consciousness. Memory becomes quickened as it reaches the mental plane, although these memories are only such as refer to unfulfilled conditions and the limitations of a previous life. The ego now is keenly desirous of taking on earth form, of being able to fight and battle against those conditions of limitation, and to overcome them. Slowly, in the case of an advanced ego, more rapidly in the undeveloped spirit, the astral dress is reassumed, and through the medium of earthly parents, the ego becomes reincarnated, taking up the battle of life where it was laid down, such as we might leave our task unfinished before retiring to rest, and continue with it when we awaken in the morning. The egos now incarnating on the first 4 or 5 planes of existence do not have memories of past births. In all probability the spiritual planes would be passed through too rapidly for such knowledge as was acquired to be properly digested. The few individuals who have reached the higher states of consciousness can remember such previous existences, and, even to the very undeveloped, the feeling that such and such people are not strangers, and the curious feeling of intimacy with strange places, makes it certain that the fleeting memory lies dormant in many of us, and is to be aroused by some chance meeting, or some new scene with which nevertheless we are perfectly familiar. To me, this theory of reincarnation is the only logical and possible reason for the apparent injustice of so many things which happen here day by day. Through the entire realm of nature what is known as the cycle law reigns supreme. That is to say, everything we know of passes from birth stage to maturity, and from maturity to decay, only to repeat the process at some later period when the various causes come together and so enable it to manifest from the tiny acorn, cast haphazard to the earth, so the oak tree grows and decays. Every winter it loses its leaves, every spring the sap rises, the tree puts forth new leaves, flowers and fruit are produced. Another ring is added to the bark, and again it sinks to slumber, until the sun and showers of another spring again, with magic touch, rouse it to life. Each year of spring and summer is a positive period of growth, a day. Each winter is a night period of negative assimilation and rest, so the tree may be looked upon as symbolical of the ego, the summers as incarnations in the flesh, the winters the period of rest in the wisdom of the gods, a preparation for the next summer or incarnation. With each incarnation something is gained. The mode, like the tree, grows, not in actual size, but in assimilated knowledge and experience. It unfolds, and the ratio of its unfoldment is as to the extent to which it has been able to grasp and digest the teachings brought to its mind-body, by the battle with life and circumstances through which it has just passed. Nor can its growth be forced. Take a half-blown rose bud, and try to press it open with your finger. Alas, poor rose. So it is with the ego. We cannot take the undeveloped and force them into an appreciation of spiritual truths. They must wait their turn, grope in the darkness until their eyes can bear the light, and then when the time comes, they need no forcing, they open gloriously from within. So it is that reincarnation enables the ego to grow in light, to expand by degrees, to correct the blind and unconscious errors it may have piled up against it in the past, and to acquire new power and purity with each successive incarnation, until at length it obtains freedom from the earth body altogether, and enjoys perpetually the glories of nirvana. Too many people labor under the idea that nirvana means extinction, a kind of snuffing out of the candle, in which process the individual becomes swallowed up in infinity. Difficult as it is to explain such matters which we do not know, for the incarnated ego cannot know truly what nirvana really stands for. Nevertheless, it is only reasonable to suppose that the crude spirit which set forth so many thousands of years ago to seek for that perfection which it may have acquired so painfully, would hardly return to a sphere of unconscious absorption in the universal. The purified individuality has been obtained with so much trouble, must rather experience a state of highest consciousness and extreme bliss, a state, indeed, we can only dimly conceive, because it is not in us to properly comprehend as yet. At any rate, it is something beyond and infinitely above the absurd ideas of heaven contained in, say, some of the hymns ancient and modern. I never can think of the hymn, Holy, 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 all the saints adore thee, casting down their golden crowns before the glassy sea, without picturing a group of white-clad angelic forms playing skittles with cumbersome golden crowns, which they chuck about aimlessly, unless it is to rest their heads, as a variation from continual chanting of praise. I do not think the writer of that hymn had a sense of humor, or he must have eliminated those lines. Certainly the theosophical idea of nirvana is something more sublime and dignified, something so infinitely great that the idea of heaven cultivated by the singularly unimaginative Catholic clergy seems too trivial for comment in comparison. Our powers of conception may be limited, but at least they can rise superior to that. Heaven is bliss eternal. To stand round all the time singing praises and throwing golden crowns about, does not appeal to my sense of the fitness of things, nor does it even seem reverent, but on the contrary. I know, as a child, my mother used to picture heaven to me as a very gorgeous golden palace, with precious stones and jewels studding the walls, floors, and streets. I used to picture archangels filling the position of the guardsmen at Whitehall, and doing a kind of glorified sentry go with huge golden trumpets to keep them company. I used to picture a great golden gate, and St. Peter, in very voluminous garments, holding the keys of heaven, passing the sheep in through the golden doors, and sending the goats to the infernal regions. And all this was somewhere up in the sky. I am not sure, when I was very, very young, that I did not also believe the stars to be some of the golden nails coming through the floor of heaven. As for hell, I was too frightened to think of it at all, but if ever a vision did arise, I know it was always as a fiery furnace where man was always burning, yet never burnt. I often wondered how it was managed. These ideas and conceptions appear so trivial and wanting in thought and reverence that it is beyond me how people can accept them. To me, now, heaven is an intangible something, too great, too holy, too mysterious for my true conception, but I know also that someday my eyes will be opened to the reality, and until then I am content to wait and trust.